back here again, and again I'm banging on about ego. Have you ever wondered why so many mystics, teachers, self-help people talk about ego, talk about transcending ego, subsuming ego, killing ego, all the things that you look at and ascribe negative characteristics to? We're going to have a quick recap on what ego is, from my perspective anyway. Ego is the group of behaviors, traits, and habits that you learned or inherited genetically. They're the things that help you navigate your way through life, survive it, take care of yourself first, ensure your safety. They're all the habits that make you who you are in a social sense and in a survival sense. They're not who you are intrinsically, that stands apart. But they are the group of habits and traits that help you to survive. If you think you don't have an ego, what do you do when you cross the road? You look both ways for traffic. That's ego. That's an aspect of ego that keeps you alive, keeps you safe. So then, what do we do when ego is no longer useful? Well, we can't kill it, because in order to get rid of your entire ego, you'd never go to work, you wouldn't take care of yourself, and you wouldn't ensure your survival. So we know we have to do those things. So if we have to do those things, some parts of our ego are essential, beneficial even. Unfortunately, where ego falls down, again, is that ego only extends to keeping me safe. It only extends to my survival, and it only extends to making sure that I'm okay. It's egocentric. Me. Ego. Me. So in order to look at ego in a different way then, we have to look at what ego is and where it came from. It came from hundreds of thousands of years of us developing, us evolving, and prior to 100,000 years ago, it was our main tool for keeping us safe. That's what it did. Then along came abstract thought, about 100,000 years ago. And we began thinking about ourselves, but ego still sat in the background, whispering in our ear, saying, you know what? You need to mind yourself first. You need to take care of you. Yeah, all this thought stuff, it's wonderful, but make sure you're okay. Again, ego-driven, ego-led. Flash forward to now, we have a problem. In order to become one whole, accepting that we are all one, ego has no place that you can discern, which is why so many teachers say, transcend it, get rid of it. But we already know you can't transcend or get rid of it really, because you need elements of it. So what do? It seems ego is important, and there's a paradox in itself. The one thing that we strive to give no importance to is the one thing that is important to us. We do need to survive. We do need to take care of ourselves. We do need to excel at what we do, because, well, that's how you live in our modern society. Now, if we look at ego as being the wild animal that lived in a cave more than 100,000 years ago, and hasn't had to evolve, hasn't had to change, hasn't had to grow in any way, we are presented with the idea that we can domesticate a wild animal. The same way as we domesticated all the other wild animals, the same way as cats domesticated us. We have to train our ego. We have to teach our ego. We have to find a way of taking our ego and teaching it that care for the whole group is care for myself. So ego has to be trained that if I do something well for the benefit of somebody else, that this benefits me in the same way. You teach an animal through repetition and reward. So we're going to teach ego through repetition and reward. You do something that is beneficial to somebody else, but it's not necessarily beneficial to you. It can be neutral, or it may even cost you something. The reward you get for that particular action is dopamine. It's the dopamine response, a reward that makes you feel good for achieving something and doing something. So we're going to spend the rest of our lives retraining ego to understand that the things I do for others, acts of compassion, acts of empathy, acts of love, all the things that ego sees as second-class citizens, that all of these become essential and central to retraining our ego, to having it grow up, to having it mature, so that ego sees no difference between good for me and good for you, no difference between good for the individual and good for the group. This is how we retrain the ego, and it's a job of work to be undertaken every day. As adults, it's difficult to retrain ourselves. As children, on the other hand, we have a chance. So we have to train our children to see the group as one, to see acts of selflessness, acts of compassion, acts of love, acts of kindness, acts of empathy as central to benefiting everyone. When we do that, ego eventually will grow up. For us as adults, it means reaching back into our memories, into our pasts, and retraining and reframing how we see events, how we see people, how we see ourselves in events, how we see ourselves in how we acted in a situation or how a situation unfolded for us. Traumas have to be reinvestigated so that we're not the central player in the trauma. We are a player in the trauma. When I was a kid, I had a particularly violent father. That particularly violent father left me with some very egocentric traits in making sure I was okay. It took me 40 more years to understand that the violence was born of fear. The fear was born of guilt, and that none of it at the start was his fault. It was his trauma and his inability to overcome that trauma. Basically gave me trauma. So in understanding and reframing that years later, I was able to make peace with the man before he died. That's not the easiest thing to do. It's not the easiest, nor is it the most understandable. But I learned compassion. I learned empathy. I learned understanding of his trauma and my trauma together. How, as the Spice Girls said, two became one. And then in understanding that his trauma was something that needed to go away in order for me to be able to forgive him, I had to forgive his traumas that happened to him, understand them, then I was able to forgive his traumas that happened to me and the traumas that I carried with me. Then I was able to understand them, and I was able to move on in understanding. When my father did die, I can safely say I sent him on his way in peace and in love. If I can learn, believe me, if I can learn, pretty much anyone can learn, that when we train our ego that everyone is the same, there's nothing we can't overcome. There's no trauma, there's no bad feeling, there's no set of life events that we can't change. Because I am you and you are me. And if I want the best for me, I have to want the best for you. This is training our ego. This is transcending our ego. This is teaching our ego to grow up. This is pulling it out of the cave and getting 100,000 years of work done, hopefully before the end of my life.